Forward. We should finish it by 12, which means Lucien has got 27 minutes to take us through some thinking and thoughts on classes, commons, collectivization, labor and the left, ideas and themes that have emerged in various ways throughout the colloquium. Lucien, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Mazibuko. This paper, I'm still thinking through some of the issues, and I'm looking forward to feedback and debate, disagreement, all of that stuff would be cool. What I've really tried to do is think through what it would mean to build a commons, what this would mean in terms of a left and working class project, and to think through how this issue has been approached historically, so to evaluate different approaches. Now, often these approaches weren't articulated explicitly around the idea of the commons, but depending how we define the commons, I think we can use this to unpack some of the issues in quite an interesting way. Now, the term commons has been given many different meanings, and I think it's quite clear that the term itself is fairly contested. And I suspect that even among our different papers, we've been giving slightly different meanings. So it's sort of like Opa said, it can be a little bit slippery. Can be a little bit slippery. When I'm talking about commons, I'm going to just crib from Peter Linebaugh and say, when I'm talking about commons, I'm talking about communal resources that are non-exclusionary in character, and that these exist in most societies. However, in most societies, commons, these communal resources that are non-exclusionary in character, by that I mean that in some sense there's commoners that have access to them, exist in the shadow of larger class systems, which are based on monopolies of wealth and power in the hands of small ruling class minorities. So the existence of a commons doesn't necessarily signify an egalitarian society. To some extent, a commons could be a bulwark of resistance against a larger class society. In some ways, a commons could be something which simply allows survival in the context of a larger class-based society. Now, the scope of commons has been contested, and this is where things like custom, memory, and oral transmission and debates around the norms of the commons come into play. There are fierce struggles over the meanings, over the claims, precisely because the commons is itself something that is contested and that is usually existing in the shadow of something bigger. To the extent that commons have existed outside the law, police, and media, and independent of government and state authority, it is also the case that they have survived in class societies to the extent that popular forces have been able to defend them. So we can say commons might exist outside of the law and the state, but they don't exist independently of social forces. They exist to the extent that ordinary people have the power and the capacity to defend them. So if we're talking about documents like the Charter of the Forest, which we could see as supplementing, complementing the Magna Carta, I think we should see these as actual settlements or peace treaties between the classes on the scope of the commons. So people might agree that they get rights of pannage in the forest and so on, but this is a bit of a treaty saying, well, we will still have this larger class system, but you'll be able to let your pigs forage and so on. In fact, many of these documents, like the Charter of the Forest or the Magna Carta, assume the existence of a larger class system with its hierarchies and inequalities, and they position the commons really as a partial refuge, as a means of supplementary income. It's precisely because most people in a feudal society like that in which the Magna Carta was generated lacked enough land and subsistence, precisely because most people were forced to give up a quarter or more of their income to a ruling class, that they needed access to commons to survive. Their own land was itself being continually a subject of exploitation. Their own produce was continually being appropriated by an upper class. Now, if we wanted to generalize the commons, if we wanted to vest, and here I'm quoting Peter, all property in the community and organize labor for the common benefit of all, make this a material reality, if we wanted to generalize commons like this, we would actually need a radical rupture with the existing state of affairs. That is to say, if you wanted commons to be the norm, it couldn't simply coexist with something which is its antithesis. Commons would have to become the norm, and for them to become the norm, that would require a radical shift in property relations and a system of collective ownership operating in the interests of most people. I say most people because common property would certainly not act in the interests of those who currently benefit from a system of enclosed private property which is in the hands of a few. This requires, in the second place, the abolition of a class system including of all institutions that enable ruling classes to monopolize property, control labor, and defend this inequitable material reality. So it's not just a radical shift in property relations that would happen through a process of persuasion. You would actually need a fierce struggle to generalize the commons, and that would mean a struggle based primarily on those who would benefit from a commons. Those are excluded, in other words, from the existing state of affairs. Logically, this means then the abolition of forms, institutional forms like corporations and states. So if that's the bigger picture, if you want to generalize commons, you need a struggle. That means you have to abolish certain institutions, create new ones. The question has then been for labor and the left, if we're thinking about a socialist project in these terms, strategy and tactics, how would you actually do that? Because it's fine, to say, well, let's have some sort of commons for everybody. Let's have a classless society. But strategy and tactics, the first point of divergence. And the second point of divergence on labor and the left has been around the appropriate institutional forms for a commons. So it's not simply a question of how do you get a commons. The question is, what do you do with the commons when you've got it? How do you actually run it? Now, I'm not going to talk about earlier socialist movements. As I said yesterday, my understanding of socialism is very much kind of coming out of anarchism and its engagement with its, warring brother, Marxism. I would also argue anarchism draws heavily on Marxism, but it's something different. So I'm not going to talk about earlier socialist traditions. That's not to undervalue them. It's just we don't normally think about Spence and Winstanley, and that's an important dialogue to have. I'm not going to have it here. Now, there have been two basic sets of strategy and tactics around creating some sort of common property for the benefit of all, that is, creating some sort of socialist society. One has been the political party model, which has been geared towards the capture of state power. As Leroy said earlier, the assumption is that the state has got a sort of empty driver's seat, that you put the right people on, then you can take the state wherever you like. You might, in a more revolutionary form, say we will create a new state, which will forcibly take over the means of production, nationalize them, and then govern them. And we'll talk about that later. More modest gradualist form is the state would slowly, through legislative and ameliorative measures, gradually shift power and wealth. Salami tactics, as Gostin, Esping, Anderson put it, where you've got a salami, you cut a slice, put it that side, cut a slice, put it that side. Over time, the whole salami is moved over there. So you don't just seize the salami, you slice it quietly. All right. So those are two approaches, but those are both assume the state. The one assumes a revolutionary state, the other one a parliamentary government with a radical party. And we can map these, the radical version, onto a lot of classical Marxism. I recognize there are many Marxisms, but the big historic current in Marxism has been the capture of state power. It's not to say there were not other currents, but certainly mainstream classical Marxism has gone for the revolutionary mode, and the other one has been social democracy. You could also have a popular movement model of creating a commons, which aims at the creation outside of the state of institutions that could supplant ruling classes in the state. And again, here you could have a revolutionary and a reformist variant. I mean, the revolutionary variant would mean some sort of movement of counter-institutions that would directly expropriate, a program of direct expropriation, and how they would run things, we'll talk about later. A more modest and gradualist form, which is one which was really what Proudhon was standing for, not really an anarchist, a sort of pre-anarchist view or a semi-anarchist view, was that you would slowly build alternatives like cooperatives, and they would slowly expand their scope, and slowly but surely they would push things back. So this is a sort of equivalent of social democracy. Instead of having this one big rupture, you would slowly build alternative spaces, and you would crack capitalism. And you could map these onto Bakunin and Kropotkin's anarchism as the revolutionary option. That's not the only one that argues this. This more reformist approach you can see in a range of ways. Kirk's not here, but I think elements of autonomous Marxism, just like Proudhon's ideas, can also be read as a fairly gradualist approach, building counter-institutions. Okay. And you could also combine these. You might, for example, argue for a state-centric model where you have nationalization, state ownership, combined with a society-centric workers' control, which is non-state ownership. I think those are very hard to reconcile. I think they're very different logics at play. Using the state and the people directly expropriating are very different ways of doing things. And as I think we saw in South Africa in the 90s, the UDF sort of model, the Fossati model of bottom-up, is actually in many ways directly incompatible with the top-down party-centered model. All right. Now, if we look at these two things, they have a very different idea of where the commons would be located. The one would locate the commons in the state through state property. The other would locate the commons in the people through their own organizations. And each of these actually applies a different way of managing the commons. If we want to look at it in terms of state ownership, or we want to look in terms of society ownership, leaving aside the tactical and strategic issues, the issue arises, how do you regulate the commons? That is, the mechanisms to decide for which purposes and under which systems of governance common resources will be placed. Okay? The mechanisms to decide for which purposes and under which systems of governance common resources should be placed. And secondly, how to distribute the products of the commons. That is, the principles governing access to the resources for consumption. Okay? How to distribute the products of the commons. That is, the principles governing access to resources for consumption. Now, the state-centric model, investing ownership in the state, vests ultimate decision-making power in the state. So to the extent that the state takes over the commons, or takes over the means of production that would constitute at the core of the commons, the major decisions will be made by the state. That could mean a range of options. It could be bureaucrats, could be technocrats, could be party leaderships. The party leaderships could be elected, they could be not elected. The bureaucrats might be under political commissars from a party, they might be under ministers, directing director generals, as we have in a democratic state, quote-unquote democratic state. And there are different ways the state could run it. You could have a central plan or a more mixed economy. But the point is the day-to-day decisions, where the commons are vested in the state, well, where property is vested in the state, it's actually not common property. It's only nominally common. It might be called public property, it's a term I hate, or public ownership. It's not public ownership. None of you own ESCOM. Okay, none of you own it. You might think you own it, the state owns it. So people might be consulted, but in a state-centric model, decisions are made not by the people, but by some sort of specialist managerial cadre, whether those are bureaucrats, technocrats, whether they're under an elected party or under an authoritarian party. Even if this system is associated with, and this is not inevitable, with decent work, good benefits, secure jobs, etc., the fact is that it organizes labor, that is the state, and the extent to which it's done for the common benefit is really contingent on the interests of the management and its power. So a positive income of this time is not inevitable. A society-centric model, on the other hand, I think at least has the potential of vesting ownership in popular organizations, at least because it nominally places direct control in the hands of the people. Now again, society-centric models can vary quite a lot, and even in the 1980s, and I don't think Leroy surfaced it as much in his presentation, but certainly, as he's pointed out to me, a lot of those democratic moments in the 80s were also subverted. It was very easy for a street committee to be turned into an ANC party branch, and for an ANC party branch to then exercise terror against other political forces. So, what I'm saying is intrinsically a statist model cannot have common ownership in that property will be vested in the state. It cannot have common and collective democratic decision-making because it's vested in the state. A society-centric model potentially allows popular democratic decision-making, but a good deal depends on the extent to which popular ownership through a society-centric model is coupled to systems of self-management and popular planning. Now, you could have common ownership with self-management and stop there. If you stop there, the danger that will appear, and this is repeatedly demonstrated, without a process of planning, you'll get a logic of egoism as individual self-managed units start to compete. Now, they might compete through a market, they might compete through other things, they might compete in a range of destructive ways, and this has certainly been the case. Cooperative models set up in a number of places have been quite competitive. So even if there isn't a formal commitment to markets in the commodity form, self-management, common ownership without planning will lead to an egoistic and competitive model. This is simply because there's no other mechanism to address competing claims on resources. Even in the absence of markets, competition will result. Now, you could have, on the other hand, common ownership, self-management, and markets, which is what Proudhon actually advocated, what we would now call market socialism. But this itself also subverts self-management, inasmuch as when you have a market imposes certain external demands on production. Each individual unit has to compete. To the extent that each individual unit has to compete in order to survive, the logic of self-management becomes antithetical to the logic of the market, which is just a fancy way of saying, if you have a bunch of competing cooperatives, they're actually subordinate to the market, not to their members. Because when push comes to shove, they have to do what the market requires rather than what their members want. That can mean very concrete things. Do you put the money into wages or into investments? If we have to compete with a low-wage cooperative, we have to go low wage. All right, so I would argue only where popular ownership is matched to self-management and some system of bottom-up planning and the abolition of the commodity form can you really have a model of commons that truly organizes labor for the common benefit and has a truly beneficial common property. Now, this brings us to the last issue, which is that of distribution. And there are two basic ways you can think about distribution, which I think we can roughly map onto a state-centric and society-centric model of change, although not absolutely. The one way to organize distribution is to link it to output. Essentially, you say from each according to ability to each according to deeds. So the one way, once you're making the stuff, the question is how do people get the stuff? And a very common approach, and a lot of Marxists, I'm not saying it's necessarily a valid reading of Marx, but a lot of Marxists said the first stage of socialism, you'll have income linked to output. So if you do a certain amount of work, you get paid more. Now, the issue here is naturally you'll have an income disparity. Otherwise, the system can't work. There has to be a reward and punishment for differential output. And there are various ways you can measure it. Albert and Harnell and Paracon actually argue for effort. Others would argue for occupational link. To the extent that you are linking output, you have differential output, you must have differential consumption. To the extent that this is translated into reality, it means people actually have to buy the goods or get special ration cards. That is to say, you do actually bring back the commodity form in a different way. If you pay people different levels, it only means something if somebody can buy something or access something with a credit. So you actually bring a market and a commodity back. You actually bring down a gate between need and actual consumption. Bakunin himself, as major anarchist figures in his early work, also advocated this. So this isn't a beating up on Marxism or market socialism. It's Bakunin called it collectivism. Now, the alternative approach, and I'm starting to wrap up here, is to have a completely communist distribution model. And this is what Marx, I think, advocated in the higher stage of socialism, what was later articulated as a distinction between socialism as a transition with elements of the old and bourgeois right, and communism as a full stage of free distribution where we leave the realm of necessity and we enter the realm of freedom. And in the anarchist tradition, in the work of, in particular, Peter Kropotkin, Elisée Reclus, and James Giuliani, this argument is made very, very strongly. Now, this is essentially from each according to ability to each according to needs. And the argument for this model as not something to be deferred to a second stage, but as something to be immediately implemented along with self-management, along with common property, along with democratic planning, is as follows. First, it's almost impossible to measure individual contribution. It's almost impossible to measure individual contribution on the simple grounds, as Kropotkin pointed out, that all of us work in highly integrated production processes. The extent to which I can sit here and talk required somebody to build a table, somebody to be generating electricity, somebody to have mined the coal that is being burned for the electricity, somebody to have maintained the plugs, somebody in a light factory to be working with glass and or fluorocarbons or whatever to do this. So the extent to which I can say this is mine as part of a collective process is actually a bit arbitrary. And Kropotkin argues it's really the exercise of power, whether by highly organized skilled workers or whether by management. But if we all contribute, it's hard to say this is mine and I get 20%, you get 5%. And we can see this with a normal situation like university, where a cleaner who's completely essential with the university will earn 1/5, an academic will earn more, a manager will earn much more. All right. The second thing is that measurement can be completely arbitrary to the extent that people might see it as a competitive process. So Albert and Harnell in Paracon argue for measuring effort by co-workers. But if the co-workers are measuring effort and they're competing for resources, or there's distrust, why would I give any of you a good rating? It would actually incentivize me giving everybody else a bad rating, but everybody else would do the same for me. So we'd have a completely warped evaluation system. The other point that was made is simply that there's a strong moral objection to this. Inasmuch as the aim of common property and some sort of self-management and the aim of some sort of democratic planning is to meet human needs and to allow people to develop their potentials and human personality, it would also be necessary to consider the injustice that arises when you link income to output, when you link income to occupation, when you link income to effort. On what basis can somebody who's, say, less healthy or less strong eat less? On what basis can you say that a professional is highly skilled, doing quite pleasant work, should earn more despite having less needs than somebody doing less pleasant work and has more demands on her or his time? Okay, so crudely, on what basis should a cleaner earn less than an academic if that cleaner is supporting 10 people in miserable social conditions in a site of social reproduction that's completely degraded with failing municipal infrastructure, high transport costs, appalling schooling, access to poor health, as opposed to, say, a single professional who can then invest their money in a 4x4 and, whatever. So there's a strong moral objection. So the argument on this would simply be that the only obstacles that should be put in place are not income levels, but first, proof that people have worked, if they are able to do so. From each according to ability implies that everybody pays a tax to society in the form of effort, to the best of their ability. So proof of work if you are able to work. Obviously, that doesn't ask toddlers if they want to work, just as in the house you don't ask your kid if they've worked before you feed them. You wouldn't do that in society. People who are studying, the elderly, the ill, and so on. I haven't talked to you about how you would reorganize work. That's a slightly separate discussion to distribution. Secondly, the availability of resources would also be a criterion to apply. Where resources are in short supply, you would have to have some sort of rationing until economic conditions permit of goods that are in short supply, a prioritizing of those who have the greatest need. For example, if there's a shortage of healthcare goods, you would prioritize the sick rather than just give to somebody so they could hoard in their house heaps of medicine. And you would also, third, look at efforts to rationalize use through mechanisms of collective consumption. By this I mean that if resources are in short supply, it might make more sense to have collective delivery methods, communal kitchens, for example, rather than individualizing consumption through everybody having a TV. You might consider communal bioscope facilities. There are a range of ways we could do it. And ecologically, a lot of that would make sense as well. Okay, so there's a side note on nationalism, which I might come back to in the questions. But basically, this is where I'd pull it together. Commons can coexist with systems of domination and exploitation. The extent to which commons survive and their scale in such systems depends on the balance of class forces. A generalization of commons to include all major means of production, administration, and coercion is a necessary condition for the abolition of exploitation, and it opens the possibility for the abolition of domination. Generalization of the commons requires a fierce class struggle, culminating in a revolutionary overthrow of ruling classes. Strategy for such overthrow that in turn reproduce systems of monopoly and minority rule, centralized states, central planning, parliamentary democracy, for that matter, will subvert future commons and commoning, inasmuch as they reintroduce class rule. Systems of managing commons that effectively place control in the hands of small elites, like technocrats through hierarchical systems like the state, or that use competitive systems like markets as means of coordination and allocation, will also subvert future commons and commoning. Systems of distribution that link income to individual output and associated criteria also reproduce a stratified society, as well as, to a large extent, require commodity forms. The commodity form. Therefore, a system of direct common ownership is a necessary condition for a true commons. Such a system cannot be introduced by a state, but only by popular institutions that have direct ownership and control of the means of production. But only where such property is regulated by both self-management and a bottom-up process of planning and the abolition of the commodity form can it be associated with the true commons, true commoning, true freedom and equality. Okay, last, commons do exist. And there are processes of imminent communism and sociality even within the society. Kropotkin points out in Mutual Aid that while it may seem completely strange to speak to people about communism, nobody asks when a lifeboat comes out to get you, can you pay? And nobody, in many cases, does everything for profit. Maria was speaking about sociality among the poor and solidarity. There are those elements. When workers went on strike at Marikana a year and a bit back for 5 months, they actually, and Capital was saying, this doesn't make sense, you're going to lose money. Of course they lost money. But there's something in there that people for 5 months went out on strike out of solidarity, and other people came and helped them. That shows that communism, in the true sense, is not something in the far future, but it exists as an imminent process. So to build upon those, to link it correctly to a strategy for change, and generalize that, I think, is something that can be drawn from our library of hope from the past, but also from present practice. Thanks.
Thank you. Instead of 27 minutes, made it 25. Well done. What did...
I've put the other 2 back in the comments.
Up to now, most of the papers have problematized some concrete questions, diverse case studies, looking at how to apply various theories and ideas about commons to those concrete questions. What Lucien has done has been to take us to another plane when it comes to thinking through quite ahead. What will it take then to really take the logic of commons to its fuller conclusion than the concrete specifics? That's my interpretation of what he has done. I will not go through the summary that he just gave, but in taking us to that higher plane, what he has also done is to think about the possibilities of various trajectories. And what systematically and structurally would be required to then have fuller and deeper commoning. I will leave it at that as my interpretation. Let's open it up for engagements. Any hands?
Thanks for a great, lucid and wide-ranging presentation. I guess I'm left, I don't know if I missed it, but I'm left asking who does the planning. If it isn't the co-workers, and I guess it comes from the ground up, but who decides then according to ability and according to need? And then, if that's the case, who regulates them from becoming too powerful again?
Peter?
Yeah, I wanted to get a couple points in early in the discussion and right away. But first of all, I'd like to thank Lucien for taking us to the future, making us think about the future. And and also doing this in some ways that we all understand. My 2 points, I think, that I want to bring up come from perhaps an American perspective, from South America, from Peru especially, where liberation theology was born. And I think that accompanying the transition from commons to communism, we definitely need to begin thinking about our spiritual path, and include this in our discussions of culture. In saying this, I'm not calling for the, joining up in traditional monotheistic religions. and that this is, I don't know if it's part of a labyrinth, but certainly it's part of traditional assemblies in North America and in Central America to have discussions such as we're having now, and let them go as long as it's needed to reach agreement, because this is what we live for. So that would be the first point that I want to make, that the abolition of the commodity form, or of producing things for money, or living for money, we need to think of that not only negatively, but positively, in other words. So that's the first one, Lucien. The second one comes from Maria's talk yesterday, and the profound notion of reflective praxis that I'd like to underline, which I don't think is separated from her subject of her research, which is the female-headed household. In addition, Lucien, to the realm of production, I think that our experience now in the world concerns the realm of reproduction. Just at the time when the human species no longer has to strive for survival as a species, but on the contrary, we're told that there are too many people, and that people therefore is not wealth, but is poverty. The question of our reproduction comes up for us. And this is led by women. So when you speak of the table in front of you or the light above us, it makes me think on the one hand of the craftsperson and manufacturing, and on the other hand, it makes me think of the coal or the petroleum. But also, we're thinking of our reproduction of the social relations of reproduction, the violence against women versus family relations, which somebody just said, relations without the commodity. Anyway, so those are, and I told you this morning that I woke up with an auto-critique, thinking of, I don't know if you're like me in this way, but as soon as I finish giving a presentation, I always think all the things that went wrong with it. But this emphasis on reproduction, or the place of the woman, and those labors, those unpaid labors, I believe is central to the notion of the commons, certainly in the past, but I think also, maybe for our future too. Those are my two comments.
Thanks, Peter. You're one of two grey-haired people in the room. You are one of only two grey-haired people in the room. So
everybody else looks
you are the
nervous.
only one with such indulgence to take long. George and Nicole.
I guess two things, I think. I wondered about the difference between societal and people-centred.
Okay.
There is an individualism, I suggested, I suppose, by the idea of people-centred. But then, and if it's societal-centred, as you suggested, who is the society? And maybe that's a dumb question, but I thought of it anyway. And And related to that, the kind of spatial and temporal scale of, it kind of relates to what Neja was saying. On what level, I hate the word level actually, it kind of implies a hierarchy, but and there's overlapping spheres of commoning that can emerge, and I appreciate that, but then still, I can't think of another word other than scale, but across time and space, how do we encourage and be part of these transformations, if that's making sense?
Thanks, Lucien. I was really interested in, and you gave a very big schematic view. I'm really very interested in you speaking about the commoning that exists today, that you say exists, and the link that has to your big vision of how do we get to this communism. And I'd like you to speak about sort of the way in which this commoning might prefigure this communism, this big communism, but also maybe to give some practical examples of today. Who can we look at, and where can we sort of draw some examples from? And yeah.
Okay, the last one.
And then almost piggybacking off that, it may not be the greatest thing, but can you, by comparison to what your vision you're presenting, but what do you think of universal basic income?
All right. Let me.
There's one more.
Okay, no problem.
Mine's very quick. There's one bad word that you said you'd talk about more later. I'd like you to talk about the whole issue of
nationalism.
Nationalism, yeah, sure. All right.
Okay.
That's great. Don't let me forget the nationalism one. All right. Let's go to universal income. Look, I mean, obviously we're thinking schematically here, and I'm trying to use the issue of the commons as a way of thinking through some of the debates on labour and the left. And the reason I'm linking labour and the left is twofold. One, I mean labour, of course, in the broad sense. Reason number one is a lot of the left comes out of the working class and peasant movements. I think we must always remember that there's a direct link. And one of the important intellectual traditions that has shaped the last 2 centuries has been the socialist tradition, understood broadly. Taking it back to Nicole's point yesterday, there's a lot of strands, there's different Marxisms, there's anarchism, which I suggest actually overlaps a bit with Marxism. Within each of these, there's a range of different approaches, and then there are other forms of socialism I haven't even touched on. Mentioned social democracy, but there's a link to class struggles. These ideas didn't pop out of nowhere. Even the so-called utopian socialists like Robert Owen were responding to massive struggles going on in society. And I think we can all feel that discomfort and tension in a society where subterranean tectonic forces are moving. And you can feel something's happening. And that's the context that generated that. The other reason I'm linking it to labour is it goes to the issue of a transition. That clearly, I think the only force that can really change society in a fundamental way is a class force. Within the society, there are many reforms that can be made, and every reform that is progressive should be supported. But there's a deep structure that has to be changed, and at the heart of that deep structure is a class system. It's not to say other oppressions are unimportant. It's not to say that they can be reduced to class. It's not to say that the class system is the sole generator of other forms of oppression. But crudely, without a movement that is based among the popular classes, the masses, you will never change society. You'll simply be substituting elites. And this movement requires operation by a different logic, antithetical to the institutions under which we live, which are the institutions of a ruling class, which is why there are hierarchical pyramid structures. Precisely for a minority to rule, a minority must centralize power and wealth. Hence the corporation, hence the state, are pyramids. There's no way the whole working class could be at the top. Bakunin argued, what does it mean for 40 million Germans to rule Germany? If they all rule, to control the state of Germany. If they all controlled the state, there would be no state. What does it mean? And if the state is like something everybody controls, why should it wither away later? You would need to abolish it. All right, now, what this society would mean is this anarchist, communist, whatever you want to call it, last stage society would be based fundamentally on universal access to the means of life. Going beyond a universal income grant in the system here, everybody, to the extent that it's economically feasible, would be covered on the basis of need. So that would mean, crudely, everything would be free. Everything. You would not buy things in a shop. You would not buy in a restaurant. Everything would be free. Society would look after itself, and everybody would pay into society with labor, and that's the last link to labor I'm making. Labor would be our contribution, consumption would be our reward, and the reward would be completely delinked from class, occupation, skill, and a whole range of other variables. Now, practical link between these sort of imminent forms of socialism and communism. I'm not entirely sure if the question is requiring me to give examples of those current things or to look about those current things in terms of a transition to something new.
The transition.
All right. I mean, I think if you're talking about a new society based on some sort of collective decision-making, common ownership, and a fairly advanced communist sociability, you need to build on what already exists, because otherwise the transition is too big for people to go from a society of a war of all against all to a society with those features. And a good example of the transition, the way these existing things provide a foundation, are mass movements at their best, like trade unions, community organizations, solidaristic associations, mutual aid societies. Those in themselves can embody the values of the future society and can provide a prefigurative, those can provide a prefigurative space. And what I mean by prefiguration is, we often think in terms, and this is a sort of apocalyptic mode of socialist thought. Everybody loves everybody here. Okay. I didn't phone you, huh? Okay. Sometimes the phones when I'm like lecturing, and I'm like, should I pick it up? Yeah. All right. I mean, there's two ways socialists have tended to think about the transition. I think Martin Buber, who was quite an interesting socialist from a Jewish background, he linked it to the Abrahamic religious traditions. He said there's two ways in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism that people have thought about the transition at the end of history. The one is the apocalyptic, where it is delivered by God. You know, Judgment Day comes, whether you're expecting it or not, it happens. It's the inevitable working out of processes. And in that case, it doesn't really matter if people are ready. And I think there is a logic of that in some forms of socialism, including a lot of classical Marxism, that socialism is inevitable. It's going to happen anyway. In that case, it doesn't really matter if people have got these sort of common features, or to the extent that people are already anticipating socialist forms. Those are generated by the logic of capitalism itself. The abolition of the capitalist mode of production within capitalism itself through the rise of joint stock companies, the organization of the proletariat by the system of exploitation itself. I would say the other mode is one in which it's more the what do people use it? It's more the apostolic mode of historic change. When you've converted enough people and you've reached, the Jehovah's Witnesses is quite big on this, when you've reached the 140,000, then 144,000 who will fit into New Jerusalem, then the change will happen. And I think this we can link it back. When enough people have been won over and organized to the new society, this possibility becomes real. So that, however, can't be done in the abstract. It has to relate to the forms of solidarity, organization, and consciousness that people have got now. It can't simply be people yelling in the desert, you know. So those imminent forms are essential from this view to the transition. Okay, and again, I'm not mapping this crudely onto Marxism and anarchism. You get forms of anarchism with their own teleologies, and Marx himself, there were a lot of ambiguities in his own thought between a structuralist and a more humanistic view. All right. Now, there's two questions around planning, and I think the way that often the left hasn't really thought through this, and the question has often been posed, like Alex Nove, either state or market. But a third option, I think, is one that needs to be explored more, and some of the most interesting work on this has been done through the thinking around Paracon, or participatory economics, by Albert and Harnell, who, drawing quite heavily on anarchism, have argued for a form of, delegate-based planning. So you'd essentially have a consultative planning process that goes from the base up in communities and in workplaces, and you'd go through several iterations, and you'd essentially poll people's needs, and you'd essentially poll resources, and then you'd work out what other additional resources would be required to meet needs, both in the form of, say, capital goods, in the form of new investments of other types, infrastructural and so on, and more labor employment. and you would go through several iterations and try to work it out. So that would be the idea. Now, obviously, this could become very unwieldy. So the necessary corollary to this is there should be as much decentralization as possible. That would mean trying to move away from a situation where you have entire countries specialized in growing cocoa, entire countries specialized in digging metal out the ground, entire countries specialized in wheat. You would try to have much more balanced, decentralized economies where there's a better mix at all local levels, simply because this is a more sustainable, I think we can see, environmental way. T-shirts from China are only cheap because it's based on cheap fossil fuel going on huge tankers. Secondly, it simplifies the process of planning dramatically. So would have a bottom-up planning, but dealing with the issue of scope and complexity, you would also need to have a radical decentralization where possible. Now, obviously, you can't decentralize a platinum mine. I mean, it's the best will in the world. We can't have platinum mine in Grahamstown. There's no platinum. But, I mean, it would certainly be possible, for example, for food to be sourced locally more. It would be possible, given the large amount of unemployment in town, to create new local industries. And this would also require a radical rethinking of the city. Now, if we apply to South Africa and the apartheid city, PE is a bit exceptional in that a lot of the factories are near the working class districts, and the black, coloured, and white working class districts are quite near to each other. But the classic apartheid city, people, including the unemployed, are displaced out of the town. They come into town, as people call it, to work. So you could also, there'd be a lot of opportunities for moving work closer to where people are and breaking down a massive division between community and workplace, and also breaking down massive concentrations of people in huge cities without work and huge countrysides without people. So a lot of things would be implied, but I think planning and would also be one of the means through which the decentralization could take place. Right. I think going on to Peter's points about the realm of production, I think this is, and issues around culture and so on, several points I noted. I'm glad I noted them at the time because my mind went somewhere else now. The one is, again, and it ties the thing of current resources and practices. Every culture has got both positive and negative, or if I want to sound quite old school, progressive and reactionary tendencies. Every culture has got both progressive, more communist tendencies and hierarchical, authoritarian, exclusionary tendencies. And in each of those, I think we should build on the positive elements. And that includes things, whether it's traditional structures around village meetings, whether this is forms of sociality and things, whether it's around sport clubs where people administer things for themselves before sport has become increasingly enclosed from above as well. So I would think in all societies and all cultures, there are many communist, in the good sense, and anarchist tendencies. Even in the societies least likely, we often work from very crude stereotypes about societies. You know, a common argument in a lot of countries or countries in the Western orbit would be, well, East Asia is very productive because those guys are all Confucian, and Confucian dudes work hard. But those are social constructs, and those exact same societies, you can see radically different democratic bottom-up processes. The same Spain that was associated with the historic Spanish anarchist movement produced a fascist dictator. No culture is monolithic, unchanging, they're all contested. And I would say, to answer my own question from earlier, that those contestations also happen on the basis of class. So I think it's important for the working class to appropriate the most progressive parts of the cultures that comprise it. And so it's also a struggle around national and popular culture. Okay. And I think for me on religion as well, I mean, I think a lot of movements have been very staunchly atheistic. I mean, even if you look at something like Catholicism, that's where liberation theology comes out of. Protestantism, which in many cases was a revolt against the hierarchy of the church, also developed its own hierarchy. So I think religion is another space where a lot of people can be reached. All right, now, in terms of meetings, daily relations, I just want to, okay, I think I'm out there. Can I just give me one moment? Okay, look, the point in such a different society is that things like meetings are not simply a matter of a means to an end. Actually having democratic discussions becomes a point in itself. They're not simply something to be expedited. They're something that really empower people and that really will have a real impact on people's daily lives. So they no longer become a means to an end. Second, the importance of changing daily lives, not just at the workplace, but in the way we relate to each other in our families, in gender relations. This is completely crucial. I think Leroy spoke earlier about the Moses syndrome. I mean, to the extent that people continue, as we do in South African political culture, to look for a strong man to save us, and this was in Afrikaner culture as much as in any other culture. There's a reason the Freedom Front got excited by Jacob Zuma and gave him a picture of Paul Kruger, because they recognized him. They recognized the patriarch. To the extent that people are stuck in those modes and we relate to each other like that and we look for messiahs, as Nsika was saying, people won't change. And to the extent that our own families are sites of patriarchy and oppression as opposed to sites of communism, I think, again, we won't change. Okay, I think those are the main points.
Nationalism?
Nationalism. Do I have time for nationalism?
1 minute.
All right. Now, nationalism is an extraordinarily powerful force at the moment. I think two things are necessary to say here. One, nationalism is a historically specific and contingent force. The influence of nationalism cannot be assumed. Very often, especially in the post-colonial world, we operate from a historical narrative, a patriotic history, in which people assume people resisted colonialism or apartheid or segregation and therefore became nationalists. But nationalism was only one current. There were other trajectories possible. In countries like Korea, anarchists played a major role. They've actually launched, in one of the hugest ironies, a new nuclear submarine called the Kim Jal-Jim submarine. It was named after an anarchist leader of the Korean Independence Army. Now it's an official state thing to terrorize the other part of neighboring countries. So currents like anarchism, Marxism, religion, democratic things have all played a role. So we need to denaturalize nationalism. Second thing is, why would we want to be critical of nationalism? And I think the answers are quite clear. Nationalism posits a multi-class movement. All members of the nation should come together and unite. And I think there, in and of itself, is an immediate veto on the possibility of a radical commons. Because if you want to build an alliance with all members of the nation, you will necessarily be building it, including with sectors of capital and of the state elite. And this is exactly what the ANC did. In terms of state elite, sure, when we talk about the sunset clauses, people assume it meant solely or primarily white bureaucrats in the central apartheid state. A slight majority of all employees of the apartheid state at its end were homeland employees. And that is the large constituents of the bureaucratic cadre that we have retained. So the ANC did actually co-opt a large section of the apartheid state elite. And at the same time, it did try to bring in sections of progressive white capital and the emergent black bourgeoisie. But to do that, a whole set of radical changes were ruled out. You could not abolish the chieftaincy if you want to win them over. You can't get rid of capitalism if you want to make nice with the IMF and the World Bank. And you can't get rid of Anglo-American if you want them to invest. And at the same time, nationalism is about using the state. Nationalism is fundamentally about a nationalist party capturing state power, and through this, the national interest and the will of the people is then expressed. And this brings in its train all the problems associated with the state and new elite. Buchanan, speaking in the 1870s of independence movements in East Europe, spoke of Serbia, which had just become independent. He said, at independence, there was no merchant class, there was no local aristocracy. The people who had been running the upper class were Turks, and many of them left. Who ruled? He said, within a few years, a new bureaucratic aristocracy drawn from the young patriots. Okay, so nationalism itself is a dead end. Yeah.
Thank you. We have to close it there and hand over to Nicole. Before she comes, before she thanks us, let's thank her. Thanks very much for bringing us together, Nicole. Okay. Nicole, we shall vacate.
Well, if I could just return and thank
Okay.
everybody for coming. I know that people like Mazibuko have come from afar, and Peter, and also sort of everybody locally speaking, and I think that the discussion and presentations have just been excellent. Everybody's been speaking about how they've been nurtured by these discussions. And yes, so thank you very much. I want to keep this session short because I'm sure that people want to get some lunch and get going, because we have been sitting for quite a while. But I want to discuss the way forward. There have been a few suggestions, and I will open out to the floor. You can just put those on the table and then we can discuss them. The one question was from somebody like Craig saying, well, he doesn't really want us to leave the discussion